Hey friends, Irene Lyon here. Welcome to this video, to this YouTube channel, and to this world of healing trauma, nervous system health, and all things neuroplasticity. And if you happen to be listening to this, not on YouTube, because we are thinking of bringing my videos over to audio via the podcast world. If you're listening to this on audio, thank you for listening. Either way, it's going to be education. I'm going to dive into a few different topics today. If you are on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to this video, to this channel. Somewhere on my page is a little bell. It's usually red. You hit that, it means you will get notified of my videos. And if you haven't yet joined my email list, please do so. I will put all that information somewhere near this video or near this audio. Now, every now and again, I get inspired to do something that is a little different. It's a little multi-dimensional. So I'm going to do some reading. I'm going to read some comments, and I'm going to bridge this into the world of what we would call medical trauma. I'm going to talk about postpartum depression. I'm also going to talk about just why as humans I believe we need to learn how to be with our physiology, our bodies, the emotions that they have, the sensations that they offer us, the animal primal pieces that us humans have, as well as, of course, the more human evolved pieces that come from our higher brain. Now, a little while back, I did a video called the stiff British upper lip phenomena and healing humanity. So there were a few comments that came from that video. I'm going to read two of them, and then you'll see how this blends into postpartum depression, also something else that we would call the medicalization of birth, and then medical trauma. I'm also going to read some of my favorite passage from this book, Travels by Michael Crichton. I'm always telling people to read certain books, and I know that doesn't always happen, so I'm going to take a very important excerpt out of this book when he was in medical school. It would have been back in the 60s, and just share what he saw with his eyes back in medical school in the 60s. Okay, so here's a comment, one of the comments from the video on the stiff British upper lip. So someone writes, "Hey Irene, I'm British, and this is how I was raised." So just a quick note, basically this whole stiff upper lip thing means hold in all your emotions, don't express, keep the emotions at bay, repress them, and just be very, very constricted and tight. Wear a lot of armor, don't show your true colors. So I'm British and this is how I was raised. I'm having to unlearn so many bad habits after suffering the consequences of pretending I am okay when I am not. The worst case of a cultural cage, because I talked about our cultures being sometimes cages for humans. So I was in France giving birth, and the team around me, so I'm assuming this was in a hospital, tried to stop me making noises. They didn't like that, and I refused an epidural, which helps with pain, numbs us. And in the last stages, they kept trying to force a mask onto me when I was screaming. I don't know if that was to stop the sounds or to sedate her, because we can also be sedated by inhaling certain things. The noise coming from me was utterly primal and instinctive and a vital part of the beautiful but arduous process of giving birth. It was painful to be shamed, but I screamed anyway. Double exclamation mark. Thanks for your videos, they really help. So here's one thing to remember, and I talk about this a lot in my videos and obviously in my programs and when I'm working with my clients. We have to remember, we humans, you, me, anybody around us who is considered a human, we are also animals. We have a nervous system like other mammals. We have organs like other mammals. We have emotions like other mammals. We have needs to express, get things out. If we have pain, we want to express the pain. Another great video I did on this is called Functional Freeze Explained. I run you through 3 different scenarios of a kid falling off their bike or scraping their knee and the process that might ensue after that, and how depending on what you do with that little one and how you do it will determine the health and development of that little one's emotions, sensations, biology, the whole 9 yards, and psyche. So first of all, there's a reason why these primal sounds are coming out. The second comment that came in via Instagram was someone just backing this up. So it's interesting when you start to bring these concepts out, people start to share stories. And so I just wanted to share this because, again, this is a great one. So one person said here, I experienced the same thing where I didn't want the epidural and they kept yelling at me to not make noise or scream. This is just so crazy. They eventually gave me IV meds because my mom demanded it. I was old enough that my mom couldn't legally make decisions for me. This is birth trauma and why I eventually became a doula and prenatal yoga teacher. So thank you for sharing this. Mystical Mamas Rising, that is your handle at Instagram. So again, same thing. I don't know if we have to prove a case to this, do a scientific study that's double-blind, placebo-controlled to prove that human beings, women especially, when they are pushing a human out of the birth canal, that deserves screams and cries and grunts and groans and snarls. It just seems common sense to me. But that, in some instances with the medical world, it doesn't line up. Truth be told, I've heard of doulas and midwives who have told their clients giving birth to shut up and be quiet. True story. It's sad to say that, but it's true, and that's supposed to be a more natural way of going through that process. Okay, so wanted to read these things. Now, I'm going to talk about something called procedural memory, and then I'm going to get into Michael Crichton. So there's something called a procedural memory. I'm going to keep this really simple. I'm going to break it down with an example. If I feel a pain, let's just say, I'm going to make this more specific to say driving. Let's say I'm driving and I see something and I'm trying to swerve out of the way because something is in front of my car. If there's no other obstacles around me and it's safe to swerve, I'm not in a highway setting or somewhere where there's just no other traffic, people, I'm going to swerve. Let's just say I'm trying to miss a squirrel or something on the road. My body, if it sees quickly that there's no danger, and we do a scan of this really quickly, it will immediately turn the wheel to get out of the way. I don't even have to think it, it just knows how to do it. This is a procedure that's being written in the autonomic nervous system, muscular physiology. I see, I react, I protect myself, or I protect that squirrel in this case, because I don't want to hurt it. Another example of something would be if a ball is coming at my head, say I'm on a soccer field playing soccer, not that I play soccer, but this is just an example, and it's coming at my head and I see it, I'm gonna maybe do this to avoid getting smacked on the head and getting a concussion. So there is an automatic, right, flinching, that kind of thing. If someone's screaming at me, I might flinch, I might do this. If I'm chopping vegetables, and my knife drops onto the floor and I know I'm wearing bare feet, which I usually do in the house, I will step back quickly without even thinking. These are all autonomic procedural actions that occur. Now, let's say, go back to the squirrel. Let's say I am on the road, I see something, and I'm on a highway and there's no way that I can turn my wheel, but everything in my body, because I don't want to run over that animal, wants to, but I have to repress it. My body has written a procedure to get out of the way or to swerve or to slam on the brakes, but because of the circumstance, I can't. That means that instruction has been written in my physiology. The muscles have wanted to act and then something stops it, something suppresses it. If I go back to the ball, let's just say I'm on the soccer field. Someone says, hey, Irene, so-and-so's here at the game. And I turn to go, hey, hi. And then when that happens, the ball hits me and I see it. But because my attention has been directed somewhere else, there's a part of me that senses it but doesn't get to react, but it wants to because someone else is saying, hey, there's this stop in energetic execution. The procedure of protecting doesn't happen. The knife, same sort of idea. Let's say I'm cutting those onions, the knife drops, and for whatever reason, let's just say I have an animal or a toddler at my legs, and I know that if I jump back, I'm going to crush them. My desire to save and help the life, whether it's an animal, a child, whatever, behind me, that is going to override me protecting my foot because I don't want to harm them. And I know if I cut my foot, it's not a big deal. I'm not going to die. I can recover, etc. So my body wanting to jump back, that procedure is stuck in it. The other example I gave, if someone's screaming at me, children, let's say, who are screamed at, yelled at, who they see things they don't want to see, and they can't go into that reaction because maybe they did that at one point and they were called a sissy, or come on, grow up, don't flinch. Those things are trapped in our body. So procedural memories are these things that just get written naturally. In this case, I'm talking about stressful, potentially traumatic situations, and they want to come out. But for some reason, something doesn't allow them to come out. Therefore, that procedural memory, and it might be traumatic, it might be just stressful, not really important if it's traumatic. There has been something that has been wanting to come out of the body, motor reaction, motor response, it gets held in, and that motor response, that motor action is trapped in those muscles wanting to release. One of the hallmarks of the work that I have been trained in, somatic experiencing, the work of Peter Levine, one of the hallmarks is helping a person gain the capacity and ability to start to get those procedural memories out, start to deactivate, start to basically really just create the circumstances, the foundations in the body, whether it's through memory, sensing, feeling, remembering what occurred back in the day, and to get them out. Now, if we go back, so that is an example of what procedural memories are in relationship to our bodies wanting to protect, not being able to, etc. So if we think about these women who are explaining this desire to groan and grunt, and the outside world is saying stop, that's like trying to put a lid on a volcano. Here's the thing though, if we do get sedated, if we do get strapped down, if we do get that epidural, the system, it's like the cutting of the vegetables. It's like swerving and avoiding the squirrel. It doesn't get to happen. And one of the things that we know, that I know through my work, again, with Peter Levine and learning from folks like Gabor Mate, specifically the importance of anger, the importance of getting emotion out. And what we know is that when emotion like anger, big emotions, big life force energy, fight, protection emotions, sensations, really, it's a whole body response. It's not just in the brain, it's the entire physiology. When that doesn't get out, that energy goes inwards. It turns inwards. And this is what can create depression. This is what creates physical ailments in the system. I've done other videos on the relationship of our held fight, flight responses, and how when we have freeze, so this would be that suppression, whether it's from someone else telling us to stop, or we are biting our lip, if we're keeping that stiff upper lip and not grunting and groaning and getting the movements out, that is happening because as human beings, not only again do we have that animal thing going on, so there's this automatic freeze reaction, we have this higher brain that can actually make ourselves go into freeze by willpower, by overriding our physiology and what we're feeling. So one example of how we can be traumatized in the medical setting, and I'm being very specific here to, obviously in this case, these women are sharing their stories of giving birth. when we are being strapped down, when we are being told to not express something, when we hold back the tears. One of my first memories, sadly, in life was getting my tonsils taken out, which apparently they needed to come out. They weren't doing very well. And when my mom and dad left, the nurse, at least this is how I can remember it, she needed to sedate me to bring me into the operating room, and she handled me. I was 5, so I was little, put me onto my stomach, pulled down my pants, or maybe opened the gown, because you're wearing a gown usually, and she just stabbed me with this needle in my butt. I don't know if that had to go into my butt muscle, but it hurt, and it was very scary. There was no bedside manner. There was no let's do this in a way that is calm, and I'm not going to want to get that shot, but at least it could have been done in a way that was a little nicer. So let's go back to Michael Crichton. Now, the reason why I wanted to read this is there is a beautiful part in this book, Travels, called A Day at the BLI. BLI stands for Boston Lying in Hospital. Now, some of you might not know, but Crichton, so he was the guy that wrote and created the films Jurassic Park, ER, the television show with the doctors with George Clooney. So he was in medical school before he became a writer and a fancy movie guy. And so this is when he did his rounds in obstetrics. And so back in the day, in Boston, there was a hospital where all the women went to give birth to their babies. And he said, I'm going to read. On my first day at the BLI, I stepped into a world that reminded me of nothing so much as Dante's Inferno. Room after room filled with women, all twisting and writhing in rubber-sheeted beds like oversized baby bassinets, all shrieking at the top of their lungs in the most hideous agony. I was appalled, he said. It was like something from the 19th century. Then he goes, the 18th century. And then the resident said, yeah, well, these women are all on scope. This is where it gets interesting. They all insist on it. They come in the door, and the very first thing they go, give me a shot. So we scope them. So scopolamine, famed in World War II movies as truth serum, was a soporific drug. I might not be getting this right. Soporific drug. I looked that up. That's basically a sedative and amnesia kind of drug. But as the resident explained, it wasn't a painkiller at all. That's why they're screaming so much. Scope's not a painkiller. And then he goes, well, what's the point? The point is it's amnesic. They're having the pain, but they won't remember any of it when it's over. They won't remember any of it when it's over. So here's the thing. They might not remember it cognitively, but their somatic physiology knows what it has gone through. And if we think of this in terms of the nervous system and activation of the sympathetic fight, flight, and deactivation, the parasympathetic, the good parasympathetic coming on board and bringing us down, these women, in a sense, were going into high levels of activation, being not cognitively aware of it. It's like they were kind of on a bad drug trip and have no clue what just happened. And in the process, by the way, they are just happening to be birthing a baby. And if we think about the importance that we now know of attunement and connection and skin-to-skin contact, and that first just that goodness, my sense, because he doesn't write about this, that ain't happening. Back in the day, that babies probably came out, and how he said there were bassinets by the bed. They just get put right into those bassinets. They get wrapped up, they get cleaned, and there's none of that yummy connection that helps to spark up the parasympathetic nervous system that teaches self-regulation. Okay, let's go on. He then writes, and a good thing, I thought, watching them twist and scream and shriek, meaning they're not going to remember it. Many of them had to be tied down to the bed with restraining straps. So again, here we have this, we're being restrained. They're probably wanting to break out, but they can't. So there's again this holding in of that procedure. That again is creating so much muscle tension in the body that isn't being able to get released. Okay, so They then say, you got to watch how you tie him down because you don't want them waking up with bruises on their wrists. But if you don't tie them down, they'll bang around and hurt themselves, pull their IVs out, and all sorts of stuff. I felt embarrassed for these women, Crichton writes. Many were wealthy and elegant, carefully applied makeup, coiffed hair, manicured nails. Now they were tied down to a rubber hamper and they were swearing and screaming, utterly out of control. I felt like an intruder seeing something I should not see. Why do you do this, I ask. They insist on it. You tell them this is what happens. You show them even. They go, I don't care, just give me the shot. I kept looking at the nurses, trying to see how they felt about it. They were women too, but the nurses were blank-faced, neutral. As far as they were concerned, this was how it was. So those nurses were shut down. There's no way that someone can see that and be completely empathetic and feeling and in good ventral vagal parasympathetic yumminess and let that happen. It would not occur. Okay, let's go on because there's two other scenarios here. Okay, isn't there another way? Oh, sure, the resident said. So down the hall were more rooms. No rubber bassinets, just ordinary hospital beds with women panting and groaning with the occasional cry of pain. Most of the beds had IV lines hanging from them. Now, here, these women get an epidural, a slow spinal drip for pain, and they maybe get a little Demerol, and they just work with the pain. It seemed much better here, much more human. Yeah, whatever, the resident said. There were more rooms down the hall. So we go further down the hall. Down there, the resident said, this is where we have the girls from the home. The home? The unwed mothers, he said, and named the home where they came from. We walked down there. You got to keep an eye on the nurses here, he said. If you're not careful, they won't give the girls anything for pain at all. Sometimes they'll let them get all the way to the delivery room with nothing at all, sort of punishment for their sins. I expressed disbelief. I was back in Dante's hell. Yeah, well, it's Boston, the resident said. So because of just the high level of Catholicism in Boston. Now, what's interesting here, I hope you picked up on this. They're punishing these girls for, becoming pregnant out of wedlock. And yet what's occurring is they're actually getting what really we could say should be occurring. None of the drugs, none of that stuff. Now, I'm not against painkillers by any means, and I'll talk about that in a second. So we went into the room. It was incredibly tranquil, Crichton writes. 4 or 5 teenage girls panting and breathing and counting contractions. Only one nurse had to tend to them, and she was out of the room a lot. Some of the girls were having a great deal of pain, and they looked frightened to be alone experiencing this pain. I stayed in the room with them. One girl named Debbie was red-haired and pretty. She was glad for some company and told me about the home and the nuns who ran it. Debbie wasn't Catholic, but her family had been angry when she got pregnant. They had taken her to the home 5 months earlier. They hadn't come to see her since. A few friends from school came to visit, though not many. Her sister wrote letters, but said her father wouldn't let anyone from the family visit Debbie until it was over. So what was interesting is, I'll go down a bit. Debbie had read a lot of books about childbirth, and she told me how the baby develops in the uterus, how it was first like a pinhead, but then a couple of months later, a beating heart and everything. So this kid, probably 14, 15, had taken the effort to learn about what's going on in her physiology. From time to time, as we talked, we would stop to go through the contractions. She asked me to hold her hand during the contractions, and then she would squeeze it hard. Again, very important here. Then she would let go until the next time. So again, here is this young girl who's not being given the scope drug to forget about everything. She's not being given an epidural to not feel the pain. She's working with the pain in her body. Then this doctor comes in, Crichton. She asks to hold hands so she can squeeze and let that pain out through a movement. Just so brilliant. Gotta wonder whatever happened to Debbie. Okay, so she said she wanted to keep the baby, but she couldn't because her father would never allow it. And anyway, she had to go back to school. And then she goes, "Can I have your hand again?" Another set of contractions. She looked at the wall clock. She told me they were only 3 minutes apart. They were all, and it wouldn't be long now, she said. I talked to some of the other girls in the room. They were all the same, all right there with the pains, paying attention, going through it. Most of them said they didn't want to see the baby after it was born. They were afraid it would be too hard if they saw the baby. So they're so young, and they're intuitively knowing that they are going to see this creature growing inside of them. And when they see it, there's going to be a connection. There's going to be an attunement, an attachment, right? So their instincts, their impulses they're more fresh. They haven't been conditioned by society in the same way. They're feeling their bodies. They've kind of been ostracized, and yet they're still being more human and animal than we could say the other wards. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit more, and then I'm going to break this down. They were experiencing intense physical pain, and they were talking about intense emotional pain, but they were all right with it. They all had a calmness and a dignity. And then he writes, meanwhile, back in the high classrooms, the private patients, the respectable married women were strapped down in rubber beds, swearing like sailors, screaming off their heads. It didn't make sense to me. The people who were being punished were having the best experience. The people who were being indulged were having the worst experience. So again, this is from Michael Crichton's Travels. This is the chapter on the Boston lying-in hospital. So if we think about this, I mean, this is getting a little long, but I wanted to read that because those scenarios, and I read this book over 10 years ago, they're so beautifully, they lay out this spectrum of these different scenarios. Now, of course, I don't know any of these women, who knows what happened afterwards, but my hunch, my gut is saying that those young girls came out of that. They probably would have had some deep sadness for having to let their babies go, and their systems, because they were so young, probably recovered pretty well. If we think about the women who were drugged up, screaming and going crazy, not remembering, I'm gonna again put a hunch out there that chances are afterwards there would have been a lot of stored junk and stuff in their system. Not only that, but even more psychotic energy, because they went through this insanity where they just had no connection to what was happening. And you know, I've worked with and I've heard of people who have gone through really intense, let's say, psychedelic experiences without knowing how to be in their body and titrate and contain, and they've come out in real bad spots to the point where their psyche can't settle and they're constantly activated for decades. And that is a real shame, because of course their intent wasn't to put themselves into that situation, but the experience that the physiology was having and the experience that the psyche was having, and then of course the safety and containment of the environment, is going to determine how you come out of that situation. Same with these women in the hospital. And then of course the ones that were in pain, not in pain, and with epidural. Again, here we have an example where, again, let's just say that has to happen. Nothing wrong with it. But the process of experiencing the physicality and the somatic changes of that process, it's there for a reason, right? It's there for a reason. So to reel this back, I started this out by talking about some comments that came in when I had done the video on the stiff upper lip. And both comments I think was so interesting, because in that video I didn't talk at all about childbirth, and yet that was what came out. So our bodies are really intelligent. There's a reason why we developed the way we are and that we can have children the way we do. My sense, my gut sense, is that a lot of trouble comes when the woman, because it's always women, when there is old stress, old trauma, when there isn't a connection to how to be with the body, this is what can inhibit the ability for the system to just naturally do what it's supposed to do. I remember Peter Levine was talking about a time when he was, I think it was his goddaughter or godson, I can't remember quite who, but mother was having a hard time getting baby out and like long labor. And he showed up and immediately went to her jaw and started massaging her jaw, and baby just came out because there was so much tension in the physiology, and the jaw is intimately connected to the hips, and the hips are intimately connected to the pelvis. So pain is not so much the thing, it is the contraction and the resistance that we get into when we're feeling the pain, as opposed to feeling the intense pain and being able to be with it, breathe with it, and if there is a need to scream and growl and hiss and cuss to get that energy out, because that is going to allow the physiology to not clamp down. There's no way that if we're clamped down and completely tense that it's going to be able to flow out as it wants to. So wanted to share that story because it's not just about what's happening in the reproductive space, it's the entire system, right? So while there is tension and there's contractions, think back to that girl, Debbie, she was being with her body rather than fighting it, rather than anesthetizing it, rather than being amnesic and just letting the system be uncontained and flying and flailing like the other women who were given that scope, that drug. She was working with the body. She was working with the system. And then interestingly enough, because those poor girls were basically shunned and shoved in a room and ignored with only one nurse, while they were getting less medical care, they were being less meddled with, if that makes sense. They were kind of left to their own devices, and no doubt they were probably supporting each other in that moment when they were in that room of the Boston Lying In Hospital. Now, next question you might have, and I know this is getting a little longer, but so what does a person do? And the thing is that how we start to heal, let's just say that you were that woman that was given the drugs, or you didn't feel anything. How would we move into healing the trauma and the tension and maybe the stored procedural memories from that? We would start in the same way I would teach anyone who's coming to see me or in my programs who has anxiety or a chronic illness or a phobia. We have to start with learning the education. So what I just told you today is very important, understanding these procedural memories, understanding the fight, flight, freeze, understanding how we clamp down, and the importance of getting that stuff out. So I talk and teach those elements in my program, so I'll be sure to post them below. Get started with the 21-day nervous system tune-up if you haven't already yet. It gets into the science and the deeper forms of psychoeducation. And then the other thing is something that you can start doing right now. Start to listen to the physiology. Again, I say this a lot in my videos. Can you connect to your impulses? Can you start to connect to the general physiology in your system? Can you listen to when you have to go to the bathroom, when your bladder is pressured and there's urine that needs to come out, when the rectum has pressure and there needs to be a bowel movement? We have become so good in our society at holding these things in and not letting them out when it needs to happen. Now, I'm not saying just go to the bathroom whenever when you're sitting somewhere in a restaurant, of course not, but usually there are facilities. So learn how to listen to that physiology and then act upon its needs. Again, another example, as little people, we're trained so young to hold it in. It's not time yet. We're not there yet. Only one person's allowed to go to the bathroom when you're in kindergarten. Just all these rules that disconnect us from our physiology. So to start to listen to those things, I know that sounds really simple, but trust me when I say it's the simple learnings of listening to the biology, listening to the impulses. When you're thirsty, drink water. When you're hungry, eat food. When you're full, stop eating. When you're tired, rest. When you're feeling an impulse to move, move. When you need to burp or pass gas, both ways, let it out. If you need to sneeze, let the sneeze be full. Don't hold it back. If you need to cough, cough. There's so many ways in which we can start to be with our physiology, the physicality of our bodies, so that we can gain that capacity again. The other thing, working with our emotions, feeling the sensations in our body that produce emotions, the tightness in the chest, the tightness in the throat, the butterflies in the belly, rather than just distracting and maybe numbing them out, or distracting with, let's say, being too busy, or however we might distract ourselves. How can we notice what's there and get curious with it and feel it, just like Debbie did in the Boston Lying In Hospital, the younger kid that was not given any pain, wasn't strapped down. She was just being with her physiology, listening to it. And of course she learned, she got books. That's so amazing to me. So wrapping this all back, I covered a little bit around medical trauma in the relationship to this topic. It doesn't have to be giving birth. It could be being strapped down for a procedure and wanting to break out but not being able to. It could be waking up from a surgery and wanting to move but you can't because you're paralyzed due to the anesthesia. There's so many scenarios there. And then postpartum depression I mentioned, and I'll go into that a tiny bit, just a tiny bit to remind you, when those desires to scream and cry and move are hindered, depressed, suppressed, we want to get them out, but maybe there's shame. That's a big one. We haven't practiced. Think if we have not expressed and learned how to express ourselves, if we are feeling shame for passing gas, for our own bodily functions, and then we go to give birth, we've got a bit of an issue there, right? Because this system wants to go into the natural ways of moving that human out of us. And if we're shy to burp in public or fart in public or let out a scream when we're mad, we got something to work with there. And so again, back to this idea, if you know that you didn't let that stuff out, work to start to get it out. Work to start to listen to your physiology. Again, time and time again, we have this connection between depression and suppression of life force energy. When we can start to wake up the system, gain more capacity, and get these energies out, we free up a lot of energy. And that's what allows our system to just bubble up with kind of effervescence and vitality, which is what we want. So longer vlog today, bit of reading, old comments. I will link everything I mentioned in this video down below. Cannot recommend that book enough. I think it's one of the most underrated memoirs out there. It goes into more of his medical school days. It goes into mindfulness work. It goes into his dabblings with meditation and crazy things like spoon bending parties in LA. It's a really fun book. It also gets into travels into Africa and Asia and all sorts of great stuff. Sadly, he passed away quite a while ago at a very young age. So I might do some more videos on some of those pieces in that book that relate to the mind, the body, the connection, and how we are in the environment. For now, I hope this video has been useful. I hope you've learned something. If you feel that this is something that someone you know might be interested in or enjoy or learn from, please pass it on. Like I said at the beginning, subscribe to this channel. If you're not yet on my email list, join. And if you have not yet started with my programs to help rewire and get back into your body and work at this nervous system level, then be sure to check those out. Thank you for being here, and we will see you next time.